Join our Patreon.
Do you really want to know? We are MythVision.
Dr. Price, we have a friend, Vinicius Serva, sorry if I butcher your name, who has a question. What do you think of a Gnostic mysteries thesis for the origins of Christianity being the notion that following Paul, or Paul probably being Simon Magus, the Gnostic masters were the progenitors of the original church of Christianity, and like Paul, they'd have transmitted secret doctrines to a few initiates, and eventually an imitation church, Catholicism, appeared. Nag Hammadi Libraries points to that, because some initiates didn't understood or accept that the Jesus story was a myth encoding the secret doctrines of Christianity. He says, if you're going to ask him that, tell him it's my thesis. We kind of just discussed that, didn't we?
Read it again if you don't mind. I'm not sure I understand the business about the original Gnostic masters and the apostles.
What do you think of the Gnostic mysteries, he's got in quotations, these for the origins of Christianity being the notion that following Paul, or Paul probably being Simon Magus, the Gnostic masters were the progenitors of the original church of Christianity. And like Paul, they'd have transmitted secret doctrines to a few initiates, and eventually an imitation church, Catholicism, appeared. Nag Hammadi Libraries point to that, he says, because some initiates didn't understand or accept that the Jesus story was a myth encoding the secret doctrines of Christianity. So it sounds to me saying the Gnostic masters were progenitors of the original church of Christianity, and like Paul, they'd have transmitted secret doctrines to a few initiates, and eventually an imitation church, Catholicism, appeared.
Well, that is the basic Gnostic idea. That is, that if you read stuff like the Nag Hammadi texts, that is what they thought. And there were people in the 2nd century who we usually don't think of as Gnostics, like Clement of Alexandria, who did say the apostles taught secret doctrines and secret traditions, which he had access to, he figured, and but he doesn't really go into what they were. As to what, well, one great writer on this is Walter Schmidtals, one of the disciples of Bultmann. I had the great pleasure of getting him to write an article for the Journal of Higher Criticism about the gospel parables being largely creations post-Jesus or even borrowed from Hellenistic Judaism. Really fascinating. And this guy, he was very conservative in some ways, radical in others. He believed that Paul wrote every inch of the major epistles, probably not including the pastorals, but he thought that they were all composites of fragments, that nobody had really taken care of the manuscripts, and that partly because in the 2nd century everybody but Gnostics and Marcionites seemed to want to shun Paul because of guilt by association, that the Gnostics loved Paul and were the first to write any commentaries on him as far as we know. And Elaine Pagels talks about that in her fascinating book, The Gnostic Paul. Well, he believed that he tried to reconstruct original epistles from the jigsaw puzzle pieces as he viewed them. But that's almost irrelevant, but I want to make clear he was conservative in some ways. He didn't say, Paul didn't write this and that. And he says if you look at 1st and 2nd Corinthians through the right lenses, it will become clear that the writer is dealing with Gnosticism in virtually every point of controversy, from eating meat offered to idols, to visiting prostitutes, to baptizing for the dead, for denying any future resurrection, the archons business, etc., 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 that he has to be dealing with Gnostics. And therefore, I mean, you could reason that, as I would, that marks these epistles as coming from the heyday of early Gnosticism, and therefore they're in the 2nd century. But he took the alternate reasonable view that Paul the Apostle wrote these letters in response to Corinthian Gnosticism, and that really in the other epistles he was usually talking about them too. And he shows how it would make sense that way. So he says that the idea of the apostles in early Christianity was taken right over from Syrian Gnosticism, where they believed that gnosis appeared on earth in the form of Gnostic revealers, gurus, that there may not have been one historical founder of gnosis, but as had been thought, but that they believed that true Gnostics had a spark of the divine in them, and that they needed to reawaken. They needed to find others who had them to reawaken them. You know why you feel like a stranger in a strange land? Because you are. Because the real you is that divine spark, and you're going to be reincarnated into this vale of tears as long as you don't understand that. But once you do, that's it. You're getting off the treadmill and going back to where you belong, where you came from, the pleroma. Well, if I am reading Schmidt's right, he thought that there were people in whom several of these sparks had concatenated or gathered somehow, so that they had intuitively the knowledge of who they really were and what the gnosis, the true knowledge, was. And that these people went around, again, like Diogenes, kind of looking for people that seemed to know there had to be more going on than met the eye, and they became Gnostics. Well, he said that from everything we learn in Gnostic sources about these apostles, that it looks like that was the original office of the apostle. In fact, another one of his great books is the office of the apostle in early Christianity. It's really mind-blowing. And so he pretty much argues that theme. Now, how did a counterfeit church grow up? Well, it looks like, to put it basically, that this was the church of the weaker brethren. Especially in 1 Corinthians, where he says, Paul, whoever, is saying that we preach Christ and him crucified, not the words of human philosophy, because that would give an edge to the elite, and God has destroyed the wisdom of this world by choosing the cross as the means of salvation. It doesn't make any sense, right? That's the whole idea. And which is a really fascinating insight, actually, because he's saying you can't deduce the doctrine of salvation from general philosophical principles. No, because it's based on an event that would not be derivable from broad principles like Platonism or something. Now, something has happened. God sent his son into the world, and if he hadn't, we'd be up the creek. But then he says, though, come to think of it, among the mature or the perfect, the teleoi, we do preach wisdom, though not the wisdom of this world. And he says that's the archons and all that. They didn't know it, or they never would have done what they did. And so this implies, and then he's talking throughout the epistle of not offending and outraging the weaker brethren who will not and cannot understand why you're doing what you're doing. You and I know that it doesn't make any difference if you're eating a steak that was originally offered to Mithras. What the heck? It's just a steak. I think of a moment in The Sopranos where Tony gives his neighbor a box of Cuban cigars, and the guy says, these are illegal, aren't they? And Tony says, they're cigars. And that's, so go ahead, what the heck, don't trip yourself up. Well, that's kind of what he's saying there. It's just meat. Now, I understand that the weaker brethren won't understand this. We all have gnosis. Yes, we do. But let's not use it to trip up our unenlightened brethren. And so that is saying there's this higher gnosis that the general run of the pew potatoes, as I like to call them, don't know and can't know. Well, what's going to happen if you can't keep your mouth shut and you start letting this stuff come out? Well, it's just like in the Gospel of Thomas saying 13, where Jesus comes up to Thomas, takes him aside, and then he leaves and Thomas goes back to the other disciples and said he taught him 3 things. Well, the disciples say, what did he say to you? And he says, I'm sorry, I can't tell you. If I told you even one of the 3 things he told me, you would stone me to death. And he says, but then fire would erupt from the stones and consume you. That's like, don't throw your pearls before swine, lest they turn on you and tear you to pieces. Clement said, don't say all true things to all men. They're not ready for it, and you could wind up getting crucified like the Sufi Al-Hallaj. His fellow Sufi said, shut up. There's no way they can understand. They're going to be outraged and kill you. Why should that happen?
Or like Paul when he goes to the third heaven and he says, the things I saw are unlawful for me to even tell you.
Right.
Like he's going to get in trouble if he even says.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
The unutterable utterances, the arata remata. You can't speak. Yeah, exactly. So Paul, many people would say, was a Gnostic. I mean, it certainly sounds like he's on the same level with the Gnostics in Corinth. They were the ones who could prophesy and speak in tongues, and others who couldn't were jealous. And he says, look, don't think that way. What about if your pinky toe said, I have no contribution to offer. I might as well get amputated. No, you're needed too. So Paul is trying to make himself one of the elite, but saying not everybody is, but you have your own role to play. That's interesting, and it assumes Gnosticism again. And who do we know in the early church that spoke in tongues? It was the Gnostics. We actually have transcriptions of glossolalia utterances they offered in the Nag Hammadi texts. And so it does look like from very early you did have a kind of inner group of Gnostics who understood and were usually circumspect about what they said. This is what's going on in 1 John, where it talks about hating the brethren. It was either the arrogance of people that figured they knew the score when everybody else didn't, or at least what the weaker brethren thought of them. Oh, they must despise us, the jerks. And so, yeah, there's good reason to believe that Gnosticism was there at the beginning and that Jesus was even understood that way. But Catholicism and eventually Orthodoxy grew up out of the weaker brethren who didn't get the inner teachings. And now whether that included that Jesus was entirely mythical, I don't know. I mean, I tend to think of Docetism as the idea that Jesus had no fleshly body at all. It was like a hologram. I tend to think of that as a compromised position between those who believed he had never come to earth in a fleshly body and those who did. And it was a way of saying, well, he did, but he wasn't really here, not physically. There's a kind of a fine line separating those. But were they pure Docetists? Well, some of them were. 1 John and 1 Corinthians 12:3 certainly talk about that kind of thing. So Harnack says that one of the big inheritances from Gnosticism was the very idea that behind the fleshly human Jesus there was some celestial being. Whether you think he was actually incarnated or not, that, he says, where do we get that? He says, well, Gnosticism is probably the originator of that, and it seeped into popular Christianity in the form of an incarnation. He said that baptism and all of that stuff must have been the inheritance from the mystery religions. Even where it appears in the Gospels of the Last Supper, there's no way that's Jewish. This is my body, this is my blood. Fertility God.
1 Corinthians 15 talks about the celestial stuff too, with the resurrection, so there's something there. This is actually good. Derek Bennett and me just did a show yesterday. I had never really thought about that, but baptism, you definitely talk about the Eucharist. We kind of go, well, that doesn't sound very... We could try to Judaize it, but But when you go to baptism, they try to go, ritual purity, washing and stuff. They try to do that with baptism, and even Derek was showing, no, there are very good reasons to think mystery school right here. So when I hear Gnosticism, I tend to think a form of a mystery school.
Yeah, they're very closely related because there was a gnosis to the mystery. You had to be initiated to learn the real secrets and all that, and then you couldn't tell anybody, which is why we know so little about them today. And the mystery religions like Mithraism also had you preparing your soul for the post-mortem ascent past the planetary spirits and all that.
Even I Googled before the show with Derek, I was like, mystery school definition. And something pops up. This just tells you flat out. Like, there were so many. Modern, if you want to check out modern, ancient. There's not a, one size fits all what the definition of the mystery religion is on Google. I'm not saying you can't open up a web search and find something. But it was just interesting to me, this is a weird little avenue, I guess you'd say, to explore, and I want to continue exploring that.
Oh, well, Helmut Kester, another great Bultmann student, whose teaching I sat under at Harvard Divinity School one semester, surprisingly to me, he says there really was no standard mystery religion, and he's doing the same thing I criticize in others. Don't you remember what an ideal type is? Because he seems to have forgotten it, but great scholar anyway. But then the third inheritance was that of the hero cults, which is why Jesus has an epic about him, and there's the darkness before the dawn. The Gospels are not really interested in Jesus' death as a saving sacrifice. It's just that here's where the hero seems backed into a corner, but in the morning he rises victoriously. And so it seems to me that even popular Christianity was the result of syncretism, and what would be difficult to explain is how it wouldn't have been, given the intellectual milieu it was in. Apologists try to say, oh, no, there were Jews who would rather die than mix pagan ideas into this. Get out of here, get real. There's archaeological and textual evidence for this. It's just that they can't face reality.
Join our Patreon